Dobroveče. Pozdravljam vas u ime Kulturnog centra Beograda i u ime Fakulteta za medije i komunikacije i izuzetno nam je zadovoljstvo i čast da, kao što znate, u našem gradu, ali takođe i u Zagrebu, dakle u zajednici Beograda i Zagreba, možemo ovih dana čuti, videti i razgovarati sa Brunom Laturom, jednim od najznačajnijih mislilaca ovog trenutka. Bruno Latour, dakle, u centru njegovih istraživanja su pitanja političke ekologije, modernosti i naučne metode. Ova poseta zamišljena je kao predstavljanje promišljanja ka jednom novom poimanju prirode i kulture. Tim povodom Fakultet za medije i komunikacije, ali i Multimedijalni institut iz Zagreba objavili su 2 sveske, eseja i razgovora kao svojevrstan uvod u takozvani uvod u Latura. Večeras gospodin Bruno Latour govori na temu Suočavanje sa Zemljom ili Facing Gaia, dakle predavanje će biti na engleskom jeziku, a naravno knjige u izdanju različitih izdavača se mogu naći ovde u holu. Nadamo se da ste već imali prilike da ih vidite i čitate i da ćete to učiniti posle ovog predavanja. A ja bih samo još da dodam da je čitava poseta organizovana u saradnji sa francuskim institutom u Srbiji i Hrvatskoj, Kulturnim centrom Beograda, književnim klubom Buksa iz Zagreba i Muzejem suvremene umjetnosti u Zagrebu. Takođe se zahvaljujemo teoretičaru umetnosti i dekanu Fakulteta za medije i komunikacije, gospodinu Mišku Šuvakoviću, koji će sada predstaviti našeg uvaženog gosta, a potom ćemo čuti gospodina Bruna Latura i naravno nakon toga on je veoma voljan da sa vama razgovara. Hvala vam, gospodine Šuvaković, izvolite.
Pa evo, želim prvo da vam poželim dobro veče i da vas pozdravim u ime Fakulteta za medije i komunikacije i ostalih organizatora, pre svega Zagrebačke mame. Ova fantastična osovina Beograd, Zagreb, Pariz deluje izgleda uspešno i obećava jedno dobro predavanje i gostovanje od 2 dana u Beogradu profesora Latura. Ja bih počeo rečima mog dragog kolege Jovana Čekića, svet se zaista fundamentalno promenio. I to je u savremenoj filozofiji i teoriji naglašeno kod niza savremenih filozofa, teoretičara, umetnika. I jednu od tih promena simbolički predstavlja Bruno Latour. To je ta promena koja nas vodi dalje iza poststrukturalizma, teorija jezika i teksta u polje takozvanih novih fenomenologija ili još važnije antropologija, pitanja o načinu na koji postoji savremeni čovek u savremenom svetu, ali ta reč svet nije samo metafizička konstrukcija, već podrazumeva planetu u njenom geološkom, biološkom, ekološkom smislu, sa svim onim krizama u kojima mi živimo poslednjih 15-20 godina. Ja gotovo se pitam ponekada da bez kriza ne bih mogao ni da živim. Zaista, krize su naša svakodnevica, a profesor Bruno Latour je dao bitnu antropološku osnovu. Bruno Latour je rođen 1947. godine u Francuskoj, studirao je filozofiju, specijalizirao je antropologiju i sociologiju, manje više iz ove 3 discipline ga prisvajaju, kao što se i njegova karijera povezuje za francusku kulturu, vezuje se za anglosaksonski svet, a poslednjih niz godina se vezuje i za nemačku kulturu, odnosno za novu školu za medije iz Karlsruhea, gde je on zapravo povezao filozofsko-antropološke teorije sa savremenom umetnošću i pokušajem da se odgovori na stanje ovog sveta. Njegove teorije su stekle veliki bitan uticaj, spadaju jednog od najcitiranijih autora u savremenoj globalnoj kulturi. Po tome je značajan što je uveo nekoliko novih bitnih pojmova. Ja ću vam napomenuti samo 2. Actor networking, to je zapravo ideja o umrežavanju i mrežama koji postoje u savremenom svetu, od sveta tehnologije, a ne treba zaboraviti da je on profesor i istraživač u laboratoriji za medije i da je jedan od osnivača studija koje su povezane sa odnosom tehnologije i nauke. I s druge strane, povezane sa pitanjem društva i društvenih konflikta i društvenih odnosa u savremenosti. Drugi važan pojam, gotovo misteriozan i mističan, ja mislim da se njegovo predavanje kao posljednju reč će imati tu reč, jeste termin antropocena, termin koji govori zapravo o novom geološkom sloju koji smo stvorili mi ljudi. Oni prethodni geološki slojevi su bez nas. Izuzetna figura koja zaista je napravila bitan korak u sociologiji, antropologiji i filozofiji. Ja bi negde antropologiju uzeo kao središte njegovog mišljenja i rada. Dear Professor Latour, we are happy that you are in our city. You are really dear guest here. We are ready for your lecture and stage is for you. Our network is open to you.
In the Edgar Poe novel or short story, Maelstrom, there is an interesting element, is that everyone, as you know of the story, is taken inside the vortex. They are all going to die. But the narrator of the story, who is a sailor, at a moment of very great attention, he looks at what happens in the vortex and how many debris are being held and taken in the vortex. And he notices that some of those debris are not sunk into the vortex. Those who look like this one here, a barrel, something which is not going down, but surviving, so to speak, because it turned around. And he has the idea of grabbing the barrel and then staying alive. So he is the only survivor of his story, and he tells Edgar Poe in the story. But it's interesting to see that even when we are in a vortex, you can still detect small differences between the debris. And this is the situation which I think we are. We are in the vortex, we see a lot of debris going down, and we have to look very carefully and with great attention at some of these things that float, so to speak. Then maybe we can grab them and not being sucked in, so to speak. So this is the reason why I start with the vanishing story of Poe, is because that will be my starting point for this lecture, we are disoriented free time. We are disoriented in time, and this is the Anthropocene argument. It was alluded to, that's a word I understood. The Anthropocene is a disputed question, but an interesting theme. But it defines the time where we are in different ways. And we are also disoriented in space. Where do we land? And most of my talk will be around this disorientation in space, what is the ground on which we actually sit. But we are also disoriented in agency. I mean, who are the agency which is given to the people right now in the Anthropocene, in what Dipesh Chakrabarti called geohistory, is a big question. First, the Anthropocene. Well, it's a disputed term coming from geologists. I'm sure you have heard of that term, and of the disputes which are attributed to this term. The interesting thing for us tonight is simply that the Anthropocene, which is this very, very, very small, it's not even visible here because it's so small, is different from the rest of the Quaternary in which we were supposed to be, and that we learn at school was the last of the many geological periods. It's very different for one reason, which is politically important, is that the rest of our time as human in a civilization, if you can use this word, has been taken place in a very quiet, relatively quiet, geologically speaking, time, which is called the Holocene. So the 10 or 12,000 years where most of what we know as history has happened, we were not, we didn't have to absorb politically the fact that the Earth itself was reacting to our action. And that's the key difference with the Anthropocene. And now we have. So that's a great disorientation in time. Whatever happened to us before, no matter how the history was unfolding, no matter how many events we had, at least there was one thing we didn't have to worry about, that was the Earth reacting to our action. Environment changed, but not the Earth system. And the Anthropocene, technically, is this change in the Earth system. Now, it's also a disorientation in space, because we now have to take into account a space which is, of course, largely modified by our own activity. This is one of the posters representing the sort of studies that anyone interested in the Anthropocene should become to analyze. So it's the old question that we studied in human geography, question of cities, the question of industry, of transportation, land use, and so on, the sort of thing we have in any textbook, but to which is added now all sorts of other things about the climate, of course, about the sea, about the deep earth, and they are themselves linked together in a way which forbid us to do what we used to do in a geography textbook, which has one layer, which was the earth and the materiality of the earth, so to speak, landscape, climate, etc. And on top of it, you could put the human, the legal aspect, the economical aspect, the symbolic aspect. And this is now entirely inside the vortex I started with. So the very definition, and come back to that later, of a soil, what is a soil, what is a territory, is being modified. And that would have very deep political consequences, as I will show at the end of these lectures. Of course, in the past, we could have had all these elements together. This is a typical plate from a very interesting textbook of the 1980 about ecology, where you would have to take into account the animals, the plant, the sun, the clouds, and you would have to calculate the interaction with all these elements. But humans in this setup would not be considered as agents, which would have been enough importance and import to modify the whole Earth system itself. So this was what was, until recently, nature in the usual sense of the word, which could be studied completely separated from the human sciences, of course. And this is exactly the change which is now happening in the social sciences as well as the humanity. Dipesh Chakrabarty, of course, with this first interest coming from Marxist theory and post-colonial study of what the climate would do to the notion of history, and of course of great transformation of history itself. And this is one of a book, important book by two of my colleagues, Bonneuil and Fresso's, The Shock of the Anthropocene, which is trying to understand how the intrusion of the question of the Anthropocene modifies very classical question in what would have been before the tradition of materialistic explanation of history. But the definition of the matter of materialism, for instance, in Marx's classical Marxism itself has changed. And that's a very important now movement in the social sciences, in history of the environment, reinterpretation of capitalism, etc., etc. All of these questions are being renewed. I mean, just one example of a new materialism, so to speak, a paper in this very interesting journal called the Anthropocene Review, which is trying to weigh, literally to weigh, the importance of the technosphere, which is now transforming the planet. And we, in this, I don't think the data are really very accurate, but it gives an idea of scale of the importance of a technical transformation of the Earth. But for every body, literally every weight of a human, you have to multiply by 5 orders of magnitude in order to get an idea of the weight of the technosphere itself. I mean, the weight of building, of cement, of earth, soil, and so on, modified by the human. This is, it's another twist, so to speak, on the notion of material explanation. So this is the starting point for me, which is this disorientation in space and time, and I would say in agency, because who is the agent in this transformation. This is the big poem of Dipesh Chakrabarti. Who is the agent of history? If we are in the Anthropocene, in this geo-story, which is happening, which has no precedent in terms of the Earth system itself. So what I'm interested in here is in another figure than nature, another figure than the globe, which is Gaia, which we have to face. But before, you need to I need to make a distinction between two very different types of globes and globalization. Because when we hear about globalization, and it's a theme which is important everywhere, including here in Serbia, is that we confuse two definitions of globalization, what I call globalization plus and globalization minus. Globalization plus is this ideal, basically at the origin, a cartographic ideal that you could absorb in more or less one great scheme, all the differences of the Earth, and that's, of course, the great transformation of the representation of the globe from the 17th century onward. This globalization implies that there is a way of, with a set of coordinates, to register as many differences as possible. This is done in anthropology, this is done in cartography, this is done in in natural history museum. It's the captation, so to speak, of the multiplicity of the Earth. It has been criticized many times by post-colonial studies, but it is a globe which is defined by its capacity to multiply the numbers of differences, so to speak. It has no connection with what we now call globalization, because what we mean by globalization now is the limit, a provincial definition of a certain type of standard, a certain type of definition of what is a human, a very small and narrow definition of what is a homo economicus, extended everywhere. So we are fighting when people are accused, and it's a question I'll come back at the end, of refusing globalization. It depends which one you are refusing. Is it globalization plus or is it globalization minus? Because if you are refusing globalization minus, I understand you. I mean, it's a normal way. You don't want globalization to be provincialized by a very narrow definition of what is about and how we are supposed to survive on this planet. So the two meanings of globalization are important because what Gaia is going to be producing, so to speak, is a very different definition of how knowledge itself has been acquired. I'll go even very far on this because, of course, this is a part of a field I'm started with science and technology studies, is that every time we know something about the globe, it's through a situated knowledge. And this is an expression from Donna Haraway, which is a sort of summary of the many things that we know about how we produce knowledge. But it's always local. The image of a globe, and here are two very famous cartographers at work, they are inside a very specific place and they produce a map of what is outside. But it's a very narrow, it's inside a network, inside a very specific place that they build an image of a globe, but the image of a globe is itself a small, never much bigger than what you can read on a table like this, which is, of course, a very classical question of media studies and STS. So the way the globe has entered into our consciousness is through not suddenly people realized they were in the globe, but because, and that the globe was reacting to our action. It's through what Paul Edwards, in what is, in my view, the best book on the question of the history of the sciences of global warming and global transformation of the Earth, a vast machine has shown. That is, the vast apparatus, and here is just one example, the set of models which have been built in order to produce the knowledge necessary to see and feel, but it's the scientists to feel, it's not you and me, to feel that the Earth was actually reacting to our action in a way which was unprecedented in the Holocene definition of geostory. We knew that environment was reacting to our action, that if you deforest a hill or a mountain, then there will be local consequences, but we had no knowledge that the Earth system itself was moving into another stage, and that the vortex I started with is actually sucking, so to speak, the planet into a different stage. So this is why this sort of document like this one, which had such an importance in the debate and the dispute and the negation of climate changes, plays such an important role. And you see, and many of these images, of course, can be shown, but this one is the iconic, so to speak, of a sort of stability and relative stability suddenly shifting to another stage. And of course, this is where every definition we can have of a historical situation, every definition we can have of a frame and the stage in which history is occurring will have to be modified deeply, because that's something happened there which is unprecedented for sometimes millions of years. So the question the figure I'm trying to bring into consideration here is the figure of Gaia. And it's a disputed figure. It's a topic of many dispute, and it's unstudied, I'd say. Gaia is a word which is simultaneously used by many people going from New Age religious sects, dancing in San Francisco's forest in the night naked, all the way to scientific work of what is called Earth system science. But Gaia is also a very important political being, and that's the one I want to insist on. To understand Gaia, we have to stage two different events, so to speak, with some exaggeration, but I think they are grossly correct. One is the famous episode of Venice, November 1609, where the beginning of what is called the Galilean universe, so to speak, the Galilean object, which is the first time, as you all know, that Galileo turned his telescope to the moon. But the other one, the episode which is not as well known, 1965, is Lovelock in Pasadena, looking not at the sky, but imagining an experiment where someone on Mars would look at the planet Earth and ask the following question: is the Earth alive? Or is there a life on Earth? And the funny thing is that Lovelock at the time, who was already a well-known scientist because he had built very exquisite instruments, James Lovelock told his colleagues he had been invited by the NASA to build the instrument in the little satellite which was supposed to go on Mars. And of course, his colleague didn't like that too much. He said, it's no use going there. It's completely useless. I can, from here, looking at Mars, know that there's no life on Mars, but if I imagine, because it's unstable, is it chemical equilibrium? But if I imagine a little green man in Mars looking at the Earth, he or she, we don't know about green men, he or she will know immediately that there is life on Earth because it's in thermal disequilibrium. So imagine an experiment which is the exact opposite of Galileo. When Galileo, as you all know and learn at school, looked at the moon, he realized that the moon is just like Earth and just like the infinite numbers of other planets. And that's the beginning of this idea of a universe as made of res extensa, or as Husserl said, of a Galilean object. Lovelock has a completely different and reverse idea, is that the Earth is highly special, but it has something exquisitely different from the other planet. Maybe there are other worlds, but in the case of a solar system, it's highly specific because precisely it is activated, we still don't know how exactly, mobilized, moved, recycled by life forms. So what is interesting is that here you have Galileo, which is introducing the Copernican revolution, as it's said, and here you have Gaia, Lovelock, speaking about Gaia, and of course, I got confused with the Queen of England. The Queen of England, who is not Gaia, is actually giving a prize to Lovelock who is now 1980, with a very old gentleman. He says things about politics which are completely ridiculous, so don't ask questions about Lovelock's politics. It's Lovelock's science which is interesting. What is interesting is the contrast between the two inventions, so to speak, and trying to push, what I use this example to push two quite different interests into, on one side, a word made of Galilean object, and another one made of Lovelockian agent. Because what is interesting in Lovelock is that he introduced a different, still the same science, the same geology, the same chemistry, the same physics, but it's not the same style of science and not the same, of course, political import. So the argument of Gaia at first, at the origin of Lovelock, is very simple, is that it's a biochemical idea. If you look, and that's one of the first table of the first papers on Gaia in the 79. If you look at the present world, you see that the carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, argon is in some proportion, and that if you were in an equilibrium, it would be entirely different. So it's a distance between what is equilibrium or disequilibrium, and the question that Lovelock asked to his colleagues at the time at Pasadena, including Carl Sagan, and the wife of Carl Sagan at the time, whose name is Lynn Margulis, a very important protagonist in the Gaia theory, is where are they coming from? Can we make a table, so to speak, of the source and origin of these differences in the gas composition of the atmosphere? So we are not in the, that's the change in the style of science of Lovelock. Here, we are not in air, we are basically breathing the unintended consequence of the excrements, if I can say that, of plants, for instance. Oxygen is not something which is supposed to be there on Earth. It's something which is entirely made by life form. But every disequilibrium between the gas in the state of equilibrium and the state of disequilibrium have to come from somewhere, and Margulis and Lovelock have the intuition that it's coming from the life form modifying for their benefit, and here is a lot of controversy, for their benefit, the balance, so to speak, of the gas of the atmosphere. This is the early question raised by the question of climate change. Climate change, modified by human, is a late consequence of the discovery, if I can say that, if you align the two arguments of Lovelock, Gaia. Actually, as I will show, it goes the other way. So climate is becoming late in the 20th century a political issue, but first it was a thermodynamic issue in the hands of Lovelock. There's nothing natural, if I can say that, about having oxygen in this room. I mean, the balance of oxygen for 30% has been stable for hundreds of millions of years, and there's nothing but life forms which produce this oxygen. And the limit between too much oxygen, everything would burn, and no oxygen, every oxygen-using animal and human would die. So it's a different type of style, because before, when you are a word made of a Galilean object, there is one thing you don't have to worry about, is the state of the stuff, material stuff there. That's why actually it can be used as a resource. If you are in a Lovelockian world, populated with agents which modify their own condition of existence, none of them can be used as a resource. And that's, of course, the change of politics. Because you are not in a world of resource, you are in a world of agent, which react to your action and can, of course, go completely in another way. So this is why there are two very different views of physics, if you want. The Lovelockian one, and the Galilean one, and the Lovelockian one are in great contrast. One is, of course, interestingly, of course, we live in Lovelockian world. We don't live in Galilean world. in spite of everything you read in philosophy of science, everything which is taught about the scientific worldview is more Lovelockian than it's Galilean because we are in it and we live in this universe. So this is why there is a contrast, if you want. I exaggerate the contrast a little bit, but it's for helping you get to facing Gaia, which can be symbolized by the title of two books. One of them, very famous Coire's book, From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe, which is a very nice summary of what happened in the 17th century. We were inside the closed world, the cosmic order of Middle Age, if you want, and then we break into the infinite universe where everything, all the stars are the same, and we are just one among the many. Or the turn, which has happened in the last 30 years, which is going exactly in the opposite direction. And this is a book by Émilie H., who is an important French ecofeminist who tried to understand this shift. And she played on the title De l'univers clos au monde infini, from the closed universe to, doesn't work so well, I told her several times, but to the infinite world. She should have said, from the infinite universe to the folded earth, because the earth is folded. It has its own infinity, but it's not the same infinity as extension. It's an infinity of complexity. And that would have been a better title, but sometimes people don't listen to what I say. Gaia is also a very simple cybernetic idea. So it's an incredible simple. This is the first drawing that Lovelock did when he invented this strange idea of a life form. And it's a completely naive system. He was himself an engineer. This is very important. Lovelock is not a scientist. He's like Galileo. He's first of all an engineer and a maverick. Galileo was a maverick. And he wrote books, and Galileo wrote books. And Lovelock loved to have a contrarian political idea. Galileo also. There is a link between the two, which is very interesting. But it's a very simple feedback mechanism, just like the negative feedback mechanism, which has been so important in the theory of science, technology, and economics, the early example of a Watts governor, so to speak. Well, I passed this one. So what is interesting here is now, how do we receive the novel, the news, of those two different ways of understanding physics and understanding the world? And Michel Serres, in a very now old but interesting book, I don't know if it's translated in Serbian or not, called The Natural Contract, Le Contrat Naturel, playing on Rousseau's title, ordered or staged a double trial. We all know about the trial of of Galileo. We think of a great play by Brecht. But we don't know about the second trial, which is the one that Serres talked about. He doesn't mention Lovelock, but it's exactly the thing. It works well in French. I don't know if it can be translated in Serbian, which is the difference between the famous quip that Galileo is supposed to have said after he had been condemned, et pourtant elle se meut, and yet the earth is moving, which is what Galileo is supposed to have said, and what Lovelock is supposed to say when he is accused of having a ridiculous idea about the earth alive, et pourtant elle s'émeut, and yet the earth is being moved. Does it work in Serbian? Se meut, without being actually modified, et s'émeut, which means is moved. Yes? It works? Well, yes. One word means it's just moving without being transformed, and the other one being moved. So it's okay, it works. So it's a new. See, we have to absorb the two news. You all know about Freud claiming that it was a great narcissistic blessure, a narcissistic wound to learn about the Galileos. It was completely wrong, because no one bothers one bit about the difference between heliocentrism and geocentrism except astronomers. It makes absolutely no difference to daily life. Now, the thing is not true of the other elle se meut. This changes everything, if you believe it or not. If you live in a world where the Earth is able to move, to be moved by our own action, it changes everything. So the funny thing is that people talk about endlessly about the narcissistic wound, which is supposed to be imposed by the Copernican revolution, but no one gets a hoot about it, and not about the other one, which is the second trial, where, on the contrary, the difference between having an Earth which is stable with human agitated on top of it, on Earth, humans still agitate, but the Earth is also agitating, doesn't get attention. This is a beautiful quote by Serre in The Natural Contract, which is trying to replay the two trials simultaneously. Science won all the rights 3 centuries ago now by appealing to the Earth, which responded by moving in the classical sense, Galilean sense. So the prophet, Galileo, became king. In our turn, we are appealing to an absent authority when we cry, like Galileo, but before the court of his successors, former prophet-turned-kings, the Earth is moved. The immemorial fixed Earth, which provided the condition and foundation of our life, is moving. The fundamental Earth is trembling. This is a beautiful quote. Right? Okay, so this is give you an idea of where we are going. That is, what does it change to move from living in Galilean object world or living in a world made of Lovelockian agents? But of course, the big question is, and this is Lovelock, and this is Margulis, unfortunately died, very important researchers, very important also to remember that Margulis worked at very, very small scale. She is the one who has discovered, and it was also very controversial, that in biology, most of the entity we take as individual units are actually made of population of other units inside it. She's the one who showed that a cell is actually a population of other organisms which in the course of evolution have absorbed other organisms. For example, ribosome, I'm sure you have heard of ribosome, is now another sort of ally which has been enrolled by several types of parasitism or, on the contrary, cooperation inside the whole history of life form. So it's very important that Lovelock has a very simple idea coming from cybernetics and looking at the Earth from Mars, and linking their work with Margulis, who has discovered how much the little organisms, so to speak, are themselves population of other organisms. And both of them, of course, would contradict many of the things which the neo-Darwinian, who attack them actually, believed scientifically. So we have to understand, and this is, I insist on that because Lovelock is not read seriously, and his argument is not taken seriously enough, in my view. The popular version is that Lovelock would have said that the Earth is a living organism and that maintain conditions for life. So it's a sort of providential model. It's not a God providence, but it's a sort of life providence that will sort of lord over the whole Earth and maintain conditions. It's a huge thermostat, if you want. And which, of course, is a very, very classical definition of nature, long before Lovelock and long before the science of natural history, which is the balance of nature. I mean, you find it everywhere in the history of ideas. And of course, it has serious apocalyptic dimension as well, because Gaia is indifferent to their fate. So you have this famous interview by Lovelock. I think I have it here, but I don't think we can watch it, because this is a PDF. But you can look at it. It's quite amazing if you want to hear Lovelock being interrogated when he's asked by this journalist, very brash journalist, well, we are not all going to die. And Lovelock says, oh, no. He's very angry. Oh, no, we're not going to die. No, just 7 out of 8 only would die. And this idea is, but in a very British, well, no, not very, impossible. And in another, at the end of the interview, he said, no, Gaia will survive very well. She's indifferent to her fate. She will just do, and the human will disappear. So this is what it is. And of course, it's a problem with defending Gaia's argument with Lovelock, sometimes difficult to absorb, especially because the name Gaia has been suggested to him by William Golding, with the famous authors of The Lord of the Fly. And there is an interesting connection here, of course, between the two. They were in the same village. And Gaia is, of course, a very, very, very important figure in mythology. Now, most of the people, when I talk about Lovelock, says, don't use Gaia because it will lead in bad direction. Talk about Earth system science, because it looks serious. And Gaia doesn't look serious. If you ask a geologist, are you a Gaialogist? They usually back off. But or a Gaia grapher or a Gaia politician, they all don't like it. And I think it's completely wrong. On the contrary, it's very, very, very important that Gaia is simultaneously an important figure for the theory of science and the inheritor, so to speak, of a mythological theme. As Baptiste Morisot wrote a very important book last year on the diplomacy and politics of ecology, said, we are in a time, using Lévi-Strauss' argument, we are in the time of a myth again, because we are in this vortex. We are lost, we are disoriented. So all these words, all the new words we have to find have to be mythical terms as well. And the nice thing about Gaia is that it's a very, very interesting figure of mythology. I mean, there's some not so nice. None of the episodes in Gaia's mythical life are nice, like cutting Uranus' balls, not something you're supposed to do with your husband. It betrays her own son, and then it destroys the grandson. I mean, it has a horrible figure. And that's great, because Gaia is not a maternal figure. There's nothing maternal about it. It's a woman figure. It's very important for Haraway and the others, but it's not a maternal one. It has a very interesting mythical history. And it's very of great importance for me that it's actually linked its originality in terms of mythology and its originality in terms of science. So, a different portrait of Lovelock, because, I insist on that, because the character, everyone knows about Galileo and Pasteur, but very few people know about Lovelock. What is really interesting is that he is an engineer inventing a very, very precise instrument. And in all of his question of ecology, in all of his question of what I call the new climatic regime, the question of instrument rendering us sensitive to the situation are crucial. So he's the inventor of a very exquisite instrument. He was very already famous. And this instrument allowed him very early on to be an independent scientist, which is very rare now in the modern science. He was independent because he was actually working for all the bad guys, the big polluters, BP and Exxon and Total and all these guys were actually very interested in the precision of his instrument to measure their own pollution, so to speak. So what is interesting is that from the beginning, Lovelock sees that because of the quality of his instrument, the enormous influence of polluting industry on the world system. And he's the first one who has the instrument fine enough to do this. So it's actually, the great invention is to say if humans are able to pollute their environment, or to, let's say more politely, to send newly artificially made chemical throughout the universe, throughout the planet, which I, Lovelock, can detect in very fine quantity, even in the Antarctica. And he did a long boat trip with this instrument to do this measurement. Then I can make the leap that life forms in the history of the Earth can do the same and produce and generate enough transformation of their own condition so that it can actually modify the way the others, plant and animal feeding on it, can work. So in a way there is a very nice thesis now by a French historian of science called Dutreuil, who has shown that in a great detail, which is that there is an Anthropocene argument early on in the discovery or invention or theory of Gaia by Jim Lovelock. This is Jim Lovelock. Okay, I don't know how much you want to hear about Lovelock, so maybe I should move to the... how much time? Do we have 5 more minutes or what? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. Depends how much you want to hear about. Yeah? You do? Ah, good. Okay. Well, then I have to give one more example, because it's one of the iconic moments. It's oxygen, because we are not used to take oxygen, the one you breathe, as a political agent, but it is in a way, because it's a poison. And the great mystery for Earth system science is that how come oxygen is there? It shouldn't be there. The equilibrium, in terms of thermical equilibrium, it cannot be there if it's not made and produced as the excrement of plants. And how come it appeared? Because it's a poison. So just one little quote, and then I will move on. Oxygen is poisonous. It's mutagenic and probably carcinogenic, and it thus set a limit to lifespan. So 1.5 billion of time in the Earth history with no oxygen. But its presence also opens abundant new opportunity for organisms. At the end of the Archean, the appearance of a little free oxygen would have worked wonders for this early ecosystem. Oxygen would have changed the environmental chemistry. See, this is so interesting in the style, the scientific style of Lovelock, is that you don't have one element and then one element and one element. They are related in a way that modifies all of the formers of all the successes of the life forms. The oxidation of atmospheric nitrogen to nitrate would have increased, as would the weathering of many rocks, etc. This would have made available nutrients that were previously scarce and so allowed an increase in the abundance of life. It's the sort of activity and the way he uses the metaphors which are so interesting in Lovelock. It doesn't mean that the Earth is alive. And that's the key thing which I want to finish this part on Lovelock. It has nothing to do with the idea that the Earth would be a sort of benevolent creature, which would be a whole organism which will make the life habitable for the life form. It's a much more interesting argument. It means that everything dead on Earth is being modified or has been modified or will be modified by life form. It's a different argument. It's like saying that your hair, of course your hair are dead, but no one would consider hair without the life form of a head which has hair on, so to speak. It's like a termite mound. If you look at a termite mound, it's dead, it's just mud. But the mud is there because it has been munched by termite and put there. The same thing with Beaver's Dam. Of course it's dead, it's wood. But it's wood which has been cut, it was alive. But the arrangement is dead. But it's there because beavers make it exist. So it's not an argument about life form, it's an argument about the presence of the interference in any single activity on the Earth, any single chemical, any single material of the activity of the Earth. It was with water, even plate tectonics, even things which are being considered as obvious, like water kept on Earth, is actually kept there by the activity or recycling of life form. And that gives you a different idea of matters. Matter is not stuff. Matter is not what is there as a resource for something else. Matter is active. And this is why everywhere now you see people interested in getting agent back to element of matter. The most important book for me in the recent time is Anna Tsing's book on the mushroom. No one would have imagined to write a book, a feminist, eco-feminist, Marxist, left book on mushrooms. Right? We had a leftist, feminist, eco-feminist book on dogs, which was Haraway one. But dogs, if you say dogs are interesting and alive, lots of people would say yes. But mushrooms? No. Now we have a book on mushroom, and we have another one on plants. Not by an eco-feminist this time, but by a French philosopher from Italy, actually, Emmanuel Koksha. Then we have a book of Forest by Eduardo Kohn, etc., etc. Every former stuff of matter is becoming an agent which has now its anthropologist to describe and its activity. This is the very exciting turn. Okay, enough. Well, a little bit of politics now. What does it change? What does it change to the definition of politics to be, in a word, made of Lovelockian agents and not made of Galilean objects? Well, one of the very important things is that the political model we have to talk about life form is not many. Actually, we have only two. One of them is the one on the right, which is the famous metaphors of the body and the members, which is the classical neo-reactionary view of politics as an organism, where organism and the parts have to be put into place. This is the famous fable of the stomach and the members. Or we have the other neoliberal version, which is the fable of the bees. Okay. Basically, if you survey the metaphors used in biology as well as in sociology or in politics, they always hesitated between these two models. Well, I'm not going to do. Now, what is interesting, and you all know about Mandeville, is that those two models implies a definition of what is matter and what is a material arrangement or a body in terms of part and whole. And it's something which is, of course, at the heart of the actor network theory to criticize. And I say that because there is a book now in your language about actor network theory. This is the idea that you can have parts and whole, and that every assemblage, every collective has to be understood with this model, which is common to the fable of to the members and the stomach, as well as to the neoliberal version of the bees and the market. Basically, state and market are exactly the same, just different in terms of time. In the organicist version, you start with the order and you define parts as being given a role, and in the neoliberal bees model, you start with the individual, they fight against another, and you obtain the whole, which is the optimum market. But the two, first, is the same, exactly the same, but also it's also based on the same idea, which is that they are parts and whole, which is, of course, precisely the critical novelty of the argument of Gaia, that this notion of part and whole has actually no bearing on life forms. And as you probably know, Damian Ortega made a very nice description of that, which is this idea that you have parts and then you assemble them, except everyone who has ever assembled something or studied engineering or followed a technical project, and I did that for many years, know that it doesn't work that way. You never have whole parts and then you assemble them. I'm sure you have in Serbia IKEA. Does it come here? Okay. You laugh so you understand what I mean. There's nothing more complicated than assembling what is supposed to be part, and you have a description, and then you spend a lot of time, and you go to a hospital and all these things. So the whole idea is that the notion of part and whole, and that has been showed by many historians of technology, is actually a description or an artifact of the way you describe and even draw parts on a piece of paper. But it has no connection whatsoever with the way technical drawing and technical machinery is actually assembled. So the funny thing is that we have, the only model we have to understand collectives is actually a model coming from a view of technology which does not even work for technology as real project. So this is where life forms are interesting. This is coming from Scott, with Scott Gilbert, who wrote a paper with two other co-authors, taking the title of book of mine as a funny sort of replica. We have never been individuals. Now, what is interesting, and these guys are not doing political theory, they are actually biologists. They work on cells. They are in the Margulis line, so to speak. And in their paper, we report here that the zoological sciences are also finding that animals are composites of many species living, developing, and evolving together. The discovery of symbiosis throughout the animal kingdom is fundamentally transforming the classical conception of an insular individuality into one into which interactive relationship among species blurs the boundaries of the organism and obscures the notion of essential identity. He's not talking about state. He's not talking about Balkan state. He's not talking about selfish individual. He's not talking about economy. He's talking about cells. And the whole textbook that Scott Gilbert wrote on this question is of extreme interest. This is the very notion that if you study biology or if you study sociology, we have a wrong political model of collective. Because that's not the way even cells interact with one another. They are not first cells and then they interact. They are overlapping. And the whole question in biology mirrors the question in sociology. And as you all know, probably in social theory now, the great question is that of the commons. The common is also a way to understand overlap. But overlapping part is as different from the two models of organism or selfish individual as it is in biology. So this is why you understand the importance of the Lovelockian model for the Earth. The Earth is not made of parts. The Earth is not it's a system in the physical sense, but it's not a system in any technical sense. It has no engineer. And that's where, well, I have to finish. What is the political entity of Gaia? This is a great question, of course, that Dipesh Chakrabarti raised when he introduced the word geostory. Are we under the authority, under the power of a new entity which is called Gaia? What is the exact type of legal or political, what would be the word, format or institution that we should grant Gaia? Which is the big question now for constitutional theory, for the theory of a common, but also for zoologists and also for Earth system scientists. It's a common question. This is what is so exciting. It completely crosses the difference between science, art, literature, question of feminism, the question of the commons, and practical and intellectual academic questions as well. What is the status of the world in which agents are now the important element and not made of object? Sorry. So, to finish, the reason why I'm so interested in Gaia, lots of scientific reasons, but one of them has to do with the present political situation, and I want to finish on that if I have 1 more minute. Which is, of course, Gaia is not nature, because nature is supposed to be made in the old Galilean theme. Gaia is a different entity, which has no political representation. So right now, the political situation is that this is my triangle, we are sort of taken between 3 different poles of attraction, if you want. We, meaning the Western politically minded people. One of the attractors is the old attractor we all know about, which is the one of globalization, which has moved from globalization plus to globalization minus. And it's an attractor which does not attract anymore. We have 2 examples of that, Brexit, and the man whose name should never be pronounced, Mr. Trump. And then we have the land. And what is interesting right now, and here I'm getting into political science, most of the people consider that the return to the land of old is actually a populist movement, as they say. And I think it's completely wrong. There's nothing populist about it. It's the sensation, the intuition by people that the globe is no longer attracting anybody. And the best proof is that we have now people who explicitly say that at the tribune of the United Nations. Get lost. I mean, we are no longer in this horizon of going all of us to the globe. We sort of knew that before Trump abandoned the climate pact. We sort of knew the Americans were not always for the good of the species, so to speak. But still, no one in America, no president at least, ever said, get lost to the other one. So this is the interesting novelty. What do you do when you learn, after having done all the sacrifice to modernize yourself, abandon your own countryside, move back to the global, that no one believes in the global anymore? You go back to the land of old, to the national or even the ethnic dimension that at least has some boundaries around it. And the one who did this are the one who invented the globe. This is why the Brexit is so interesting. The Brexit is really the most important historical event. Trump is not so interesting, but the Brexit is. They invented the damn globalization. The damn Brits built this idea that the world was actually a huge global market. And they are the first one to say, sorry, we made a little mistake. Now we go back to our little island where it rains all the time, which is small, cold, wet, and immensely boring. Back. The one who invented the globe are back there. Okay? So if the Brits who invented the globe are doing this, think of the others. Think of all the others in Europe, and you can name many here, who say, okay, well, if the globe is abandoned, then let's go back. But there is a third attractor. And that's where the whole political move that I was mentioning in mentioning Qing and all the others are actually directing our attention. The third attractor, for want of a better term, is the earth. Let's call it Gaia. If you don't like Gaia because it's too controversial, let's call it the earth. And this third attractor has very, very specific elements, which are not the globe. It's not nature, it's not the globe, at least not globalization minus. And it's not the old locality either. It has highly specific features, and I think that's where, and this is one of my friends who is trying to render in more figurative way this shift to the third attractors. She should have mentioned the fourth attractor, which is not there, which is on the other hand. All the way there, you have Mr. Trump. Fourth attractor, it is very interesting, hors sol, offshore. That is the simultaneous promise of infinite capitalism and infinite back to the America of old, which is, of course, an impossible combination, except on one condition, that it denies climate. If it denies the climate regime, it can work. You can simultaneously say to the people, back to the earth, back to the old America, and let's make a lot of money. But only if you deny climate, which we do. So the only logical thing in this strange Trumpism is the climate denial. So politics is moving now here. This is my argument. The whole argument is trying to figure out what is this third attractor there. And it's not nature. It's not, we are finally getting out of the ecological question. It has nothing to do with ecological question. It's a question of subsistence, existence, life and death. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your great lecture and good arguments and some provocation and some contradictions, of course. Every good lecture have some contradictory conflicts inside of it. Before we start with the questions, in some way my task is to remember all people in public about your books published in Serbia. Because it's some way context of our thinking and working. The first book is Nikada nismo bili moderni, Mediterranean Publishing, a few years ago. Istraživanje o modusima života, FMK 2015. Mreže društva sfere, few days ago. Published. Misli na izložbi, niz eksperimenata u ZKM, pa objavljeno pre par dana ili barem u PDF-u od pre par dana. Ove knjige, these books, construct some kind of the atmosphere or anthropocene of your work here, on some way. And we have to start with the questions. Well, maybe that I will start with the first question, and then we can continue with your ask, comments, etc. I find in the script connected with your lecture this sentence: there is only one Gaia, but Gaia is not one. This construction is in some way secret, holistic. And I feel when you connected ecology, ground, history of this planet, styles of the discourse about the planet, you try to introduce some kind of the secret way of holistic thinking. Is it right or wrong?
This is a difficult question because simultaneously it's a critique of holism, especially the notion of global view, but it does connect. So my whole strategy since actor network theory is trying to avoid holism by avoiding the shift between levels. And that's why in terms of sociology it would be against Durkheim, precisely because you would have two levels, one which is the interaction and the one which will be the social structures. In terms of biology, it would be the thing that Scott Gilbert just mentioned, which I mentioned from Scott Gilbert, that is this idea that you would have a body organism, and then you would have parts in it which would make the body, which would obey the body, so to speak. So the whole atmosphere is connected, yes, but it's not holistic because it avoids at every point, including in my interpretation of Lovelock, which is, of course, one of the key things where you detected what you call a contradiction.
Contradiction.
There's no contradiction.
It's not contradiction.
No, there's no contradiction because it's precisely not holistic. Mm-hmm. But it's a great...
But you use the style of holistic.
No, I use connections. Mm-hmm. But the connection...
What kind of connection?
Well, they are flat connections. The whole actor network theory is precisely to avoid the two levels, one on top of the other. And of course it has consequences, I agree, but it is the key thing. I just organized a meeting. This is why I'm laughing interior, because I organized a meeting in Venice exactly on this question last week, and I'm sorry to say, and this will give you great pleasure, that some of the people I invited were back to holism. Mm-hmm. And I to tell them, no, it's wrong. But they kept giving an holistic story. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult, and of course Lovelock himself had to fight against that.
Yes, I try to imagine, for me, reading your texts, especially I like book Reset Modernity, and I read these many texts which are mapping some thinking about these subjects, and for me it was really very difficult to understand and to connect. How you can connect Gaia and Anthropocene?
I know the connection is obvious, because Anthropocene was, in a way, as I showed,
Is it Anthropocene part of Gaia, or Gaia is some kind of superficial structure of...
No, we realize Gaia because of the Anthropocene. Because, as I showed this is a very interesting question that you raised, because it is the origin of the very idea of Gaia is actually starting from the pollution poem in the 60s and 50s even.
Yes, I remember.
So the two are connected in a very history of science way. Of course, Gaia is much longer than the Anthropocene, but we realize now that we can study the Earth system science on a long range, largely because of an investment made in science because of the Anthropocene situation. Yeah. So it goes the other direction. So you have to resist the temptation of holism when you read me, please.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
It's a temptation, but resist it, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, questions? Pitanja, molim vas. Izvolite.
When we say we think about humans. We think about humans, right? But there were people that were aware of human agent in connection to the earth. Like there were Indian legends about human race emerging as punishment for rebellion of the animals, or people being transformed into rocks as a reward instead of as a punishment. So when did this shift came to be?
the question is this limited to human and we should consider other life forms, or is it that there were human cultures which did not have this separation between nature and culture?
They had separation, but they were aware of their own...
oh, yes, okay. No, of course, you're perfectly right. This is why I cited several of his works by anthropologists who are basically shifting the understanding of a modern and reconnecting with lots of other ways that in other cultures had been, of course, extremely different attention and linkages with non-human forms. Of course, I agree entirely. This is why, basically, this is now a sort of obvious element in anthropology. Still, there is a difficulty in several of his work. I'm thinking of Eduardo Cohn's book on the forest, which recognizes to the people he study a way of having the forest think, which is not human-centered, which is perfectly true. But the problem is that the political issue that the Anthropocene faces, and this time it's us, the developed countries, with, is unprecedented. So no matter how important is the learning from the other cultures, which before we had stopped being modern, were considered as pre-modern, but now they are considered as contemporary of us. Yet all of us, they and we, are facing with an unprecedented question. And that's reopen a symmetric anthropology, which I'm very interested in. So it's a very important question. Yes, many people, many other cultures, actually, we also, if you talk to any of your parents doing any sort of gardening or who have some memory of what was agriculture 50 years ago, will tell you the same thing. Many other ways of entertaining connection to the earth. First, they were considered as reactionary, because this is a very important turn now in the study of soil and of earth. Most of the interest for earth and soil, basically since mid-18th century to the late 20th century, were considered as reactionary. Back to earth.
Yes.
Retour à la terre in France would mean really completely reactionary.
Back to the roots.
Right. So it has very reactionary aspect. This is why it's so difficult to negotiate this third attractor. And immediately when you say this sort of thing, people immediately, I'm sure there were people who would ask me a question, you want to go back to the cave and being lit by candle. You don't have to ask the question, I did it for you.
Yes, 40 years ago, I have lived 10 days in one New Age community. It was half feminist, half radical, some people who left urban way of life, and every evening they play together. And for me it was the concept, maybe some ideology. For them it was
that's why you said only 10 days.
Feeling of the planet.
Only 10 days.
And in your lecture, what you feel by planet? What is your relation with the planet?
No, I have no...
I think personal, not academic.
I'm from Burgundy.
What?
I'm from a wine family.
Yes.
I do the best wine on earth.
Word.
So this is my answer. I mean...
It's a great answer. Ok. Sljedeća pitanja, molim. Izvolite.
I want to say how beautifully made those books are. They are much better than what we do in France, I have to say. This is magnificent. They are very well done. I say that to the publishers because it's rare to celebrate the publishers.
We are yet modern.
Okay, so my question is, I'm very curious, like you said that the former stuff of matter is becoming an agent that anthropologists are about to study. So I'm curious, like, are the Okay, so like when you mentioned before that the former stuff of matter are becoming an agent, or that they are receiving agency, or I don't know how to express it. So you mentioned that maybe in the future anthropologists are about to study that. You mentioned the example of the beavers. So I'm curious, like, about the methodology, like, let's say the focus. So if we are going to explore their agency, are we going to study beavers, the forests, the cut trees, or like something in between? And are the anthropologists the only one who should study that, and how would that go further?
Well, that's a very important question for research strategy, so to speak. Well, in a way, yes. This is what anthropologists of what they call the ontological turn have been doing now for the last 30 years. That, I mean, it's obvious in anthropology of science, which is my original field, you cannot do anthropology of science without studying the science and the object which have been produced by this science. So that's the classical answers. Anthropologists have to go all the way to the understanding of the agents with which the people they study are activated. So exactly in the same sense that if you're an anthropologist of religion, you have to study the spirits that are activating, I don't know, a New Guinea, a New Guinea nation like, I don't know, the Anga of my friend Lemonnier. You have, if you are an anthropologist of studying people who are connected to the beavers, interested in the beavers. The best, I think now position on this question is Morisot's book on the wolf. He wrote a very interesting book on the wolf. Yes, he said it's of course the wolf in relation with the humans, but the relation of the wolves between themselves becomes a crucial connection you also have to study. For one good reason which he shows is that people who try to make a diplomacy with the wolf are actually don't understand what's happened to the wolves themselves. So for example, they say, let's kill the big wolves. But when you kill the big wolves, the small wolves become sort of deviant adolescents. They don't know where, you have broken the hierarchy of a group. And he says, see, the more you want to understand how we are going to survive with the inhabitant, he called them the cohabitant, the wolf, you have to understand more and more of what those guys are doing with themselves. Does this mean that anthropologists become natural scientists? Yes. But the problem is it's reciprocal, because there's not one single situation now where you can study wolves without being deep into the question of the Anthropocene. I'm studying people who are in geochemistry. I mean, these people in geochemistry would never have heard or seen or imagined that they would have to deal with question of social sciences. But yeah, not one single site I'm studying is immune from the interaction with the humans. So it goes both ways, and that's what, in my view, is the most exciting aspect of a university, which in general is a pretty boring place. But in this new connection, which has nothing to do with openness of mind, it's not because people are more open of mind, it's because they are trying to do field work. And they see, the geochemists see the humans, and the humans see the beaver, so to speak, if I use your example. That is a difficult question.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. So you're obviously concerned about the populist wave and the sort of anti-science attitude that comes with it, and you wrote about it, actually sort of complained that your work was misused in that sort of way. But still, I think there is a kind of a piece of the puzzle missing here. In understanding the origin of this vortex and the sort of maybe a main social component that triggered this sort of course of events of Gaia. So the way you portrayed, even visually, Galileo and Lovelock here is Galileo is sort of looking through his telescope, you know, and kind of observing the nature in a sort of a detached way, and then Lovelock has his little detector for carbon dioxide. They just detect and observe things, but really science and that kind of knowledge is also something that got us into the vortex and all the mess, and the sort of climate change is really inextricably linked to scientific knowledge. I'm not really saying this as a sort of a critique of science, but just to get a sort of a full picture of the Anthropocene and the main social component, and to sort of face the reality and the choices we can't really do without science. But it seems to me that that's the sort of angle on things that was sort of missing from what you were.
Yeah, this is a very fruitful question, because this is why I actually introduced the notion of styles of science, because of course I dramatize when I oppose Galileo and Lovelock. This is a stage dramatization, so to speak. My idol is to rewrite Brecht play, but for Lovelock and not for Galileo. I did a play actually on Gaia, but it was not as good as Brecht, I have to say, unfortunately. Yes, but the styles, yes, you were completely right, because science is part of the problem and part of the solution. And it in a way, all of these disciplines which are talking and making us sensitive to the state of the transformation of the Earth system, science have also been associated in many, many ways in the history of science with the creation of a prime in the first place, if this is the line of your argument, and I agree with that. But as an historian of science and a sociologist of science, I know also the enormously many styles of science that exist. So this is our responsibility as intellectual and social scientists to cultivate the diversity of regime of science and styles of science. Now it's not a moot point, because, as you know, because of the thing you alluded to, which is climate negationism, science has to be defended. Some sciences have to be defended while some still have to be attacked. It's just that now the responsibility of intellectuals is not to position themselves vis-à-vis science as a whole, but to select this science, not this science, this one, this science, this one, etc., which is the normal extension of the question of STS and the conflicts, that what I call controversy mapping, that we have been developing over the years. I think we cannot get out of this question without having to decide which political science we want to associate ourselves and align ourselves with. So it's not science as an independent sources of knowledge. It's which knowledge counts and which knowledge doesn't count. And it's easier to make this argument now that we have Mr. Pruitt as the head of the environment, Department of the Environment in the United States, because he has his own list of blacklisted sciences. All of the scientists who talk about anything related to Earth system have to be blacklisted. He's a sort of McCarthy of science. So it helps us saying, okay, then we should react, not in the name of an independent science, even though this argument can be used as well, but in saying, okay, the world in which Mr. Pruitt and Mr. Trump are negating this science is not the one we live in. So it's a way of repoliticizing the question of political science, of science policy, sorry, that is you emphasize very rightly. It's a very important question. Which science do we align ourselves with? It's a question which before we didn't have to take into account. We said, okay, well, there's a world of science and there is something else, society or something. But now we have to do our shopping, so to speak, and for political reason. I don't want to live in a world of Trump and Pruitt. This is war. It's a war situation. In my play, which was a beautiful play, the scientist who is attacked by negationists say, go tell your masters that scientists are on the war path. And that's a very important turn. It's not, we defend the truth of science. We are on the war path. You attack us, we are on the war path.
This Anthropocene theory, does it have some roots
I'm not in. I mean, you say you are in, we are in.
No. This theory
Yes.
of Anthropocene and human impact on the Earth, does it have roots in the Vidal de la Blanche Géographie humaine?
Is it what?
Vidal de la Blanche, French geographer. And,
okay, sorry. Yeah, funnily enough, lots of his themes are geography. We are back to geography, Gaiagraphy. We are all back to Gaiagraphy. Yes, Vidal de la Blanche and the great French tradition of interest between physical geography and human geography, we're back to it. This is very funny because in all of this question of ecology, you always find endless numbers of precursors. So that, I mean, historians of the environment have a great fun at showing that every single thing which has been said in 2017 has been said in 1980 and then in 1970, and then they go up, and it's true, all the way to the beginning of the scientific revolution. No, the Industrial Revolution, let's say. Since the Industrial Revolution, there's a whole book now in France at La Découverte, which is called The Ecological Origin of Left or something like that, of socialism. I mean, they are all there. And Vidal de la Blanche is there, and also, of course, all our great geographers, and Fourier is there, everybody is there. But the problem is that none of this perception that the Industrial Revolution was creating an Earth system change has actually registered, especially because the left has ignored it in a way. The connection has never been made between the left fight, I exaggerate, but not much, between the left side and the ecological fight, except in the very recent time and only very marginally. There are still people, the ecological movement have disappeared everywhere. I don't know about Serbia, but in France there's not even one possibility of finding them. They just disappeared. And the connection is still a very problematic one. People still in France in 2017 say you have to choose between economy and ecology. So yes, everybody since the beginning of the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, say there is a prime connection between the question of injustice, the question of environment and ecology. Yes, but the divide is still the ecological question and very social question. Don't mix them. So the relay of socialism has not been taken by the ecological movement, and that has to be the detriment of both. Because socialism in France, the party, in the official name of the party, has almost disappeared, and the ecologists too. So it's a slight problem of political theory. It's a slight problem for me.
Yes, from the left side, the look on the ecology people is that ecological people are middle class without class consciousness.
Well, they spend a lot of time forgetting that feminism was a very important fight. So the left has not been so good at absorbing the new type of fight. But it goes both ways. I mean, it's just that the relay has not been taken. Polanyi said, Polanyi wrote this amazing book in 1945 about that neoliberalism was finished. It's the best book of the 20th century, but it's not the best in terms of prediction of what would happen. Because the missing part is the relay, the non-existing relay between the ideal of a social question, socialism to solve the social question, and the one solving the earth question. And the relay was not taken. So the task of the present is to make this relay. That's why Gaia is so important.
Thank you for the lecture. I just have one question in order to see whether I got your argumentation. So basically, if I understood correctly.
Can you show?
Okay, do you hear me now?
Where are you?
Oh.
Okay, you're very far. Okay. Sorry.
Okay, so my question.
It's hard to hear when you don't.
Okay, so you hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, if you say that the Earth is folded in a way of being conceptualized politically as a globe, and that primarily being dependent on humans as Homo economicus, so what would it entail in political agenda of Gaia to conceptualize human action, historical agency? I mean, if that is the only way how we can just prevent from falling back into these nationally circumscribed spaces, reconceptualizing Earth not as globe but as Gaia. I mean,
it depends how much time we have.
But what would be
it's a big question.
an ideal?
No, I was not talking about the time we have on Earth. I was talking about the time we have now.
Thank you.
Well, one way of answering, this is a huge question. One of them is, of course, that the agency which is provided by the term Anthropocene and which has been criticized by every one of my friends, Stenger, Saraway, Tsing, etc., for good reason, is that completely absurd. I mean, the idea that the agent of history would be the anthropos, again, the human race, so to speak, is completely ridiculous. But don't forget that the theme Anthropocene comes from geologists. They are not used to differentiate very much among the human race, those who are responsible and the ones who are not responsible. So there's a problem of agency at the beginning with the notion of modernism is over, now we change. One of the many, I mean, there are many features. The second one is, of course, that the notion of agency, as we discussed before, is now spread among many more agents. So the very definition of a human agent is already spread. This is the beaver thing we talked about, Howes dogs and Tsing mushrooms. And of course the whole anthropological literature about many other agents. So there is a reassessment of anthropological multiplicity of agents which before were pre-modern and which are becoming contemporary. Now we understand lots of things about the anthropological literature in a very practical way. This is the argument made by Vivero de Castro that we are learning from the Amazonian Indian, how did you survive? You survived. Maybe this is something we would need we too would need some of the recipes to survive. So a new discussion between many of the other type of cultures about what it is to survive. The book by Tsing, by the way, is called How to Survive the Ruins of Capitalism, How to Live in the Ruins of Capitalism. So the notion of ruins of capitalism is a very important element to answer your question. I think right now one of the things I find most productive is the rethinking of the notion of commons. Because in the notion of commons, there is a whole literature now on the many other ways in which you can act as a member of a collective, which resonate with a long history. Well, it's interesting because, of course, Serbia itself has a long history in the time of autogestion. How do you say that in English? I don't know. Autogestion? Self-management, which was a big thing when I was young. I mean, Yugoslavia for me was completely associated. Tito, Yugoslavia, and self-management was associated. Well, all the things...
And forgotten Kardil.
They are forgotten.
It's person who introduced theory of self-management.
Who is this?
Yugoslavia, Kardil.
Oh, yes. It is in this book I just reviewed, by the way, I reviewed a book for Le Monde called the Dictionaire des Biens Communs. And I was amazed by the fact that all of this Yugoslavian laboratory experiment is now back again as contemporary, not as old and passé, but contemporary. Because suddenly the whole different type of cultures realize that you cannot produce a collective in the opposition between organism and atomic element selfishly fighting together. There is no world for that. The two great inventions, which is basically the 17th century, the Hobbes and Locke invention of a choice between state and individual, does not allow to live. Does not allow, before we sort of knew that, but now we know it doesn't allow to live. So there is a great reinterest of the notion of commons as a different way of associating and collecting capacities, which are not necessarily focused on the human. This is why I like to dramatize things a little bit. So we are not human in the Holocene, in the modern period. We are what I call earthbound, which is a better word, I think, earthbound, in the Anthropocene, working in commons, which is a very different type of dramatization of humans, yes. But there's a link between common and communism, of course. The story of communism is not finished. Well, I should not say that in Serbia. Maybe it's not a good idea to say that. Communism, well, okay, let's not forget about it. Commons, let's talk about the commons. but your question would require a lot of work, collective work, because it's a very important question. Is how many different definitions of humans are we allowed to entertain in order to begin to address the question of shifting from a word made of a Galilean object to Lovelockian agent? Because of course, the very notion of systems of production, which was a great model for materialist explanation, is also shifting. Because a system of production with Lovelockian agent, something else. We have now beavers, we have mushrooms, we have forests, we have all sorts of agents collectively cooperating in many different and surprising ways with the way to survive. So all of the notions which traditionally we associated with society, with socialism, with collective are also shifting.
Još pitanja? Please. Samo mikrofon, molim vas.
At some point I need to eat and drink.
Drink, yes.
Yes, this one is the last. Because we start.
It's last.
We do that tomorrow.
Okay, thank you for the amazing lecture. And my question maybe is not now on the track of the previous ones, but still I would like to hear. In one of your texts, you mentioned how Anthropocene evokes the evaporation of sublime, what you call. And I was just wondering if you can elaborate a bit on that and how much of sublime is left in the new constellation on the Earth, and maybe how it affects something that can be called the limitation of science or can be observed as a limitation of science as well. So a little bit on that, if you feel.
Well, I would be very interested in your reaction to this question of the sublime, because it's a test which I'd like to do, and I did a bit in the exhibition I did in Reset Modernity, because the sublime, my hypothesis, but it to be tested, is that on all this question, you cannot feel the sublime, in the classical definition of the sublime. Because in the sublime, you had to be distant from the spectacle of nature. Now we are in it. The sublime, you had to be overwhelmed by the size of the phenomenon coming to you. And now, with the Anthropocene, we learned that we are at the size of the world that we see. In terms of terabyte of energy, the human industry and agriculture is actually at the level of plate tectonic in terms of energy spent every minute. So, I mean, we are no longer small compared to the immensity. Remember all this beautiful sublime idea, you are very small and you see an enormous mountain. Well, now we are enormously small looking at enormously big looking at that. And the third feature, the Kantian definition of sublime, is that in spite of this enormous magnificence of the world and the smallness of our body, we were infinitely big in our soul and consciousness and morality. But now when you contemplate the Anthropocene, you will not associate, for example, Mr. Trump with a great morality compared to that. So we feel, on the contrary, guilt, or maybe not guilt, but responsibility. So we lost the free element which allowed to develop the feeling of the sublime. Now, I'm sure you, because this is an art history question, of course, there is a dark, black sublime. How beautiful to see all this catastrophic view of landscape destroyed by oil refinery. How long can you sustain it as a sublime? I'm not sure, but I mean, people would say that, very dark, but it would be too nihilistic to be developed as a, because in the sublime there is something beautiful, necessarily. How big my soul compared to this stuff, which is great and big and strong, but it's just stuff. Volcanoes, earthquake, beautiful earthquake, look at that. Beautiful earthquake if you are safe. But if you are in the earthquake, in the vortex, it's not, my guy, in the first image I show, it doesn't feel the sublime. He's trying to find the barrel to which he can catch so that he's not sucked in the vortex. But this is an experiment. It's a this is why I like exhibition. It's exactly the sort of thing you can do in an exhibition. Do people feel the sublime or not when they see these things? And we did a little bit of that at ZKM. Maybe we'll discuss that in the next slot. This is a very interesting question, the sublime.
Yeah.
What is your answer?
I think it's a paradox of the state being that we are so somehow humble, is that the word?
Yeah.
And somehow so small compared with nature, but then in the same time on the human scale, as in the multiplicity of humble beings, you're so huge and we are so somehow unable anymore to somehow embrace the sublime, I think.
So you would tend to agree with me? No, because being humbled by the spectacle of icebergs or spectacle, and then see, I took a pictures. The feeling that when I was young and we went to the US going through Greenland, you saw the outside and you saw the beauty of the icebergs and Greenland. And now when you get on top of Greenland, you don't feel, you feel humbled, but you also feel that my own trip with this plane is actually causing, in part, a change in the way the ice is actually disappearing. How can you feel the sublime if what you look at is actually disappearing because of your action? And because how can you feel you are a great soul on top of this immensity of just stuff? Because I don't have a great soul when I'm on this plane feeling this. I feel just embarrassed. Maybe not guilty exactly, that would be too much, but embarrassed, let's say. So humbled, yes, that was the tradition. Humbled by the greatness of nature, but embarrassed, that's a new feeling. And it's a very difficult feeling to get, especially when you have kids. All of the scientists I interview, after 5 minutes they talk about their children and grandchildren. What will I be as an agent? This is a way to get into this question, a very important question of the lady there, which is also, how do we have actually kids with this responsibility to share in the misunderstanding or embarrassment, let's say, of being unable to understand the earth on which we reside. And I think that's extremely complex, and it's interesting to see that it interests ethicists, theologians, moralists of all sorts, but also artists. It's an immense repertoire for artists.
Thank you very much for your great questions. I start with the questions because I'm born in self-management society, and finish, thank you very much for your great answers and for your, of course, lecture. Thank you.